everyone. Thanks for staying up until the very end of the presentations. I appreciate it. Today I'll be talking to you about my capstone and internship work that I did regarding the analysis of forestry cooperative pilot projects that were developed by the Ontario Woodlot Association. So I'll start by giving you a brief introduction about the history of forestry in Southern Ontario. This figure here shows the sheer level of harvesting that took place by European settlers rather, removing wood in the form of saw logs, square, waney, boom, and dimensional timber. You can see this started around the 1870s up until the 1910s. So a lot of wood was harvested from forests in Southern Ontario, and this resulted in wide-scale soil degradation as a result of deforestation that occurred in these soils. So as you can see in these photos here, we have sandy conditions that resulted from the wide-scale deforestation, and you see the stumps that are remnants of that. So the chosen solution at the time was to reforest Southern Ontario with conifer plantations. The choice among these was red and white pine plantations. Red pines were especially well suited to rebuild the humus layer, which in turn stabilized the soil. And through proper forest management, these plantations could become exceptional areas for regeneration of native hardwoods to rebuild floral and faunal biodiversity, as Bridget touched upon earlier. According to the OMNR, some larger forests containing plantations, such as LaRose Forest that Ben mentioned, Durham Regional Forest, New York Regional Forest, have been well managed over the past few decades and we're now seeing that transition from conifers to natural hardwoods. However, when we compare these larger publicly funded woodlots to smaller, more fragmented and orphaned plantations that are private, there's a large disparity in their management and their structure. Some of these smaller private plantations that have been planted over 70 years ago, as you see in this photo here, it's not very clear, but they haven't been even thinned firstly at all since they've been planted. So this poses an issue. The presence, however, of these private plantations presents an unlocked opportunity in several dimensions. Firstly, the plantations contain relatively valuable wood fiber that hasn't been utilized. Harvesting this wood fiber can result in large profits to landowners, benefiting them. And importantly for the ecosystem as a whole is the prevention of stand collapse through thinning. Conifer plantations were not meant to stand the test of time. And generally after a few decades, they need to be managed to ensure the area remains productive and the transition starts. So despite this unlocked potential, we still see conifer plantations dotted around the landscape in Southern Ontario. Why is this? Well, landowners can lack the education and awareness that goes with their woodlots and don't know that these woodlots are not native and require thinning. Secondly, for those who do realize the management that is required in these woodlots, there's often a high cost to get the Forest Service professionals out to even look at the woodlot. And as a result of this, we see some landowners either selling or converting their woodlots to different uses such as agriculture to reap the better tax benefits as a result. So here's where the Ontario Woodlot Association comes in. They've created one cooperative and from this, they've created two pilot projects, one in Huronia and one in Fleetwood, both in Southern Ontario. And you might be asking yourself, oh, what's a cooperative? Well, I'll explain that next. Cooperatives in general follow several key guiding principles that allow them to function and provide value to communities that they operate within. The Ontario Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs defines some key aspects of cooperatives, which I'll cover here. So the first is membership. Cooperatives are voluntary organizations open to everyone. Secondly, they're democratic organizations, additionally, that are controlled by their members who participate in key decisions like electing board members and making decisions. Thirdly, members contribute equitably to and democratically control the capital of their cooperative. Fourthly, cooperatives are autonomously controlled by their members, and entering into partnerships with various sectors is done in a way that maintains democratic control of the cooperatives. Education is also a big part. Cooperatives provide education and training to their members and staff so they can contribute effectively to the sustainable development of their organization. And lastly, cooperatives, often they're small grassroots organizations who work for the sustainable development of communities through policies approved by their members. So the Ontario Woodlot Association's cooperative resembles an integrated management marketing cooperative group. So this figure is kind of busy, but I'll walk you through it. I just want to point out a few things. So it's not my figure, it was created by someone else. But in the middle here, the Association of Producers Concentration Yard is essentially where and how the OWA would operate. So it would oversee all the modes that are needed to obtain product from woodlots of its members. So things like harvesting, inventory work, tree marking, and etc. Are overseen by the OWA. And then the product that comes from the member woodlots is aggregated into a larger, essentially pool. And that way they can argue for better prices and higher profits to their landowners. One important aspect of the OWA cooperative is the formation of economies of scale clustered around a geographic area. So as you can see here, this is the Fleetwood Creek watershed, one of the pilot projects in which the OWA operates. You can see in green, we've got properties rather, and the red, there are plantations. So you can see that these properties are clustered very closely together. And this benefits landowners in the sense that it helps bring down the cost for forest professionals to come out and perform their services rather than having them scattered very far apart. A similar approach was taken in Huronia, the other area of the pilot project that I mentioned. So now moving into my objectives, my main objective was to evaluate the cooperative pilot projects that were created by the OWA. And I did this in 3 steps. The first step was to investigate the OWA cooperative. So during my summer work, I worked closely with the OWA, sitting in on board meetings, visiting landowners, speaking with landowners and looking at their plantations and their properties. All this to get a better idea of the mission values of the OWA, what's important to them, and how it operates. After this, I went into literature to look at other cooperatives generally, but also look at forestry cooperatives in Canada and both internationally to see what aspects of these cooperatives make them successful, what are not so great aspects, and overall how they operate. And lastly, with all this information, I was able to evaluate the cooperative that the OWA created. So now moving into the meat of things of my evaluation. The Canadian forestry cooperatives that I looked at were located in British Columbia, Quebec, Southern Ontario, and Nova Scotia. It's kind of cut off, I don't know why. And then internationally, I looked at a cooperative in Vermont and a larger cooperative in Finland. So with all this information, I was able to establish an evaluation matrix. 6 of these decision criteria I chose were part of the OMAFRA criteria that I mentioned earlier. I added a few more that were especially important to forest cooperatives, such as best management practices, and tying into that is biodiversity and conservation. So these 2 are very important for for cooperatives that are operating forestry programs to ensure that the wood supply is sustainable and the forests in which they manage are sustainable essentially into the future. And then lastly, because we're operating in Canada and in the forestry sector, Indigenous involvement is always important. So to evaluate these, I evaluated them on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being the least effective, 5 being the most effective. And I evaluated each cooperative with each decision criteria to come up with a grand total. And this was my essential grand total of evaluation that I obtained. So to give you some context, I want to draw your attention to the first column here. I know it's kind of busy, but let's look at the first column. The Athol Forestry Cooperative is one that's located in Nova Scotia. It scored a bit lower, and I kind of want to tell you why this was. So firstly, democracy. And I just want to mention also that all of this ranking was based off of information that was available online. So in the form of guides, journal articles, news articles, and also reports that are provided by the cooperatives. So amalgamating all this information and consolidating it into numbers was something that I did to achieve these numbers. So yes, moving back to democracy, the Athol Forestry Cooperative didn't really show much evidence that the members could contribute democratically to elect board members and also serve to decide decisions that were being made by the cooperative. So that's why it scored very low on that. Another thing was Indigenous involvement. There was also no mention that there was any consultation done with Indigenous members in this area, even though they do occupy and operate on unceded territory. So that's why they scored low there. And the last low score was landowner education. There were no resources available to landowners to educate them in terms of forestry or how the cooperative functions as a whole. Conversely, as you see highlighted in gold here, the OWA did fairly well, and I'm going to delve in a bit deeper on why that was. So when we're looking at the important characteristics of forestry cooperatives, the metrics can be broken down into the 3 pillars of forest sustainability. In terms of ecological benefits, the OWA places a high value on conservation and biodiversity through their management plans. Along with these practices, the OWA consults with foresters who employ best forest management practices, avoiding high grading and other practices that degrade the woodlot, and also result in employ invasive species management. Their management plans have also been approved by MFC, where applicable, and also the organization plans to work sustainably towards FSC certification. Socially, the OWA provides many opportunities to educate landowners in the form of webinars and educational resources. Members also have democratic control with respect to decisions that are made. In terms of the pilot project, and in addition to the OWA as a whole, it's a nonprofit organization, and the 21 chapters that operate or that it oversees in Southern Ontario are able to participate in decisions being made. However, the one area where I found the pilots that were lacking was Indigenous involvement. The OWA, just want to comment on Indigenous involvement. This can kind of be tricky because the area in which the OWA operates is in Southern Ontario. And while it is on unceded territory, it does operate with private plantations. So these are smaller woodlots. So it might be kind of difficult to integrate Indigenous involvement in this respect. However, some cooperatives have reserved seats on the board. For example, if we go back to Medway, who did very well also in the third column, they reserved 2 spots on their board for Indigenous members. And another thing I want to look at is that the OWA has a strong community focus, operating with local service providers and professionals. Economically, as I mentioned before, member contribution is essential. So the OWA, while the pilot projects are still in their infancy, they do not currently have a membership fee attached to them. However, this is the plan in the future, so this is on its way to becoming feasible. Economies of scale is something I already mentioned, and this is already being implemented. So delving a bit deeper into the economics of things, one key aspect that's very important to landowners is obviously the cost of services through the cooperatives. So I did an assessment on the cost between OWA cooperative budgets, 61 properties as a whole in the Fleetwood Creek area, as well as one private woodlot, which was harvested very recently. As we can see by this total cost here, the total average cost of one management, you see the OWA results in a $52 per hectare of savings on average. If we extrapolate this to the average area of woodlots in the Fleetwood Creek watershed, which is 19.1 hectares, this results in almost $1,000 in savings per thinning. And as we know, conifer plantations require multiple thinnings over the course of their lifetime. So because these are private plantations that are often owned by families, couples, or single persons, this is not an insignificant amount. Additionally, I want to point out the OWA absorbs the upfront cost. So that upfront cost that I mentioned that was a big barrier to entry is absorbed by the OWA initially and is taken out of the money that comes from harvest later on. So just to briefly go over some of the costs that were involved in calculating these metrics, things like tendering, contract prep, tree marking, prescription preparation, tree inventory, supervision by the OWA, and invasive species management where applicable, were all taken into account. So there's a lot that goes into managing these woodlots just to get them thinned. So overall, I would say the OWA does very well. It scores very well as a cooperative model, but I do have some recommendations in terms of aspects it can improve and things to keep an eye on in the future. One of them, as I mentioned, is to include Indigenous involvement where possible. Secondly, is to ensure that running capital remains consistent and healthy. Cooperatives operate as essentially businesses, so ensuring that running capital remains consistent and healthy is essential to providing its services to the communities that it operates within. This kind of ties into full-time staff. So some failures of cooperatives in the past have resulted in no full-time staff being employed and relying on volunteers. This is very detrimental. The OWA does have some full-time staff currently, so this is great, and they should keep this up. And lastly is focus on membership growth, or at least not have membership decline in the future. They're the life and blood of the cooperative, and without them, it is sure to fail. So ensuring that there's steady membership growth is essential. So thank you for listening. I'd like to just acknowledge some key people who are part of this project. Sally Krigstin here, my academic supervisor, John Pineau, part of the OWA, the executive director, Kimberly Snar, who is also my internship supervisor, Paul Robertson, who is a wealth of knowledge, who is the business owner of Trees Unlimited, and also the president of the OWA, Eleanor Reed, the president of the Fleetwood Creek chapter of the OWA, and everyone else who is involved. And also you guys, MFC staff and faculty, thank you so much for an exciting year and a half. It's been great. Thank you.
Fantastic. A nice high note to end the presentations. John Pineau is your external and he's online, and I'll let John ask his questions.
Thank you. It's a great presentation, Sean. Really well done. It was great to have you for 4 months on this. I just wonder if you have been able to see a whole iteration where we basically started and did the prescriptions, the tree marking, the invasive control, and now we're doing the harvesting right now in Fleetwood. But if you had a whole year to study this, it might have given you an even more comprehensive outcome. But it's really good what you come up with. So thank you. You feel we're on the right track. The big question for us is the economics, and is this going to be viable? Is it something that will work and that we can adapt and move out across Ontario, because there's such a need with so many orphaned and fragmented plantations and all of these trees we've spent years planting and no management's being done. Do you see this as being economically viable if we move it forward and continue this way? Or are we, we're trying these pilots as a risk mitigation, but just some thoughts on that, maybe some deeper thoughts on that in terms of how it's going to work economically. Maybe it's unfair because you haven't really gone through the whole iteration of a complete cycle with the co-op. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, John. It was great working with you. So yeah, I mean, I haven't, so the budget that I looked at was essentially projections. And because we're just starting, or you guys are just starting harvesting now, I guess we won't get the realized profits until a few months into the future. So, I mean, in that respect, it's kind of hard to comment, but with the projected budget, it seems as though the revenue that's coming in, as long as it's consistent and as long as you're not putting up too much money up front, so the costs of getting the services out there, I think as long as these balance, I think it'll be okay. But yeah, I think really I would have to delve into the actual economics and details of the budgeting. There are a lot of upfront costs that you guys absorb. So that would be, I guess, my only kind of, I guess, concern. But apart from that, because there's, you guys are able to argue for and lobby for negotiate good prices because you have all this volume. I think you're in good standing. But and also additionally, I know you guys have gotten grants, and as long as you continue to work with government agencies and other authorities to continue receiving these grants, I think you guys will be in good standing.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Sean. Thanks for reminding me of that. At some point they have to stand on their own 2 feet and function economically without grants. But we did get some help from CRIBE, the Center for Research and Innovation and Bioeconomy, Ontario Power Generation, and the Ministry of Northern Development, Mines, Natural Resources, and Forestry, so that we wouldn't be sticking our necks out too much in covering those upfront costs. But that's the kind of thing you have to do to mitigate the risks in the future. It's our hope that these co-ops will be self-sustaining, and I think you made a really good point too on the need for staff versus volunteers, and we have a lot of volunteers right now, and that's something we have to think about. So thanks, Sean.
Yeah, thanks, John.
I'm going to pass the microphone to the supervisor, Sally Krigstin.
Hey, Sean, nicely done. Very clear presentation. So when I look at that, I think was your last sort of recommendation, which was growth, membership growth. So I see two groups in this sort of scenario. You have groups who are already members of OWA, and then you have many woodlots who are not involved with OWA. So the OWA, I can understand where we can get growth there for the cooperative, but what about the ones outside of that who aren't involved, don't have any education? What do you see in bringing those people in? Do you think you can convince them to come in? Would this help them join up with OWA?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sally. Thank you. So yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, I think just this kind of case in point, once we get the results of, as John mentioned, the economics of this are important. But once we get all of these results in, it would be good. I mean, obviously, if they're positive, which I think they will be, it'll be enough evidence to kind of hopefully convince other landowners who are operating or reside outside of the operating area of the OWA to kind of take on and be involved in the cooperative. The OWA already operates, as I mentioned, it has 21 chapters in Southern Ontario, so it has a pretty wide reach in terms of area. I guess the question is, I guess maybe it's kind of like a marketing question of how to actually market this beneficial service. The OWA does currently do some on-the-ground work in, passing out brochures to woodlots, like front door brochures to woodlots to get more people involved. It's definitely a challenge, I think, because I don't really know the percentage, but there are, I'm sure, a reasonably high percentage of woodlot owners who just like plantations as they are, and they don't want to mess with the structure of the plantation because they really enjoy it. So I guess it's a personal preference. So I guess it's several dimensions. Like firstly, it would be how they feel, I guess, and if they would be willing. As another dimension would be reach. So if we can actually reach out to these members and convince them. I think those would be the main two dimensions, and they would definitely be difficult. But I think that the OWA does have resources to get this message across to the landowners. I hope that answers your question.
Great. Jay, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, I mean, my question ties into the same sort of these same sort of questions. I'm wondering if there's actually been surveys of landowners to see what their priorities are, and rather than thinking of the cooperative as trying to market their idea to maybe the landowner association better offer the services that the landowners want.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I just put up a slide of three landowner objectives that we were able to determine. They're all very similar, but I guess maybe this is kind of a biased sample because they are already involved in the pilot project. But essentially, they all are concerned with biodiversity and restoring the national forest cover to improve the wildlife habitat. So these already, I guess, align with the objectives of the OWA. I guess that answers the first part of your question. Does that answer your whole question, or?
Not really. You guys seem to all be about harvesting. And meanwhile, what I'm seeing here is forest cover and wildlife.
Yes, well, I mean,
You don't have to necessarily harvest to improve wildlife habitat.
I disagree, Jay, in these stands you do.
Yeah, this is what
I
I,
don't know. I
like-
don't know. There's not a lot of pine in our, there should be more pine in our landscapes at the same time.
There's lots of pine in southern Ontario, all hundreds of thousands of hectares of it all over the place.
All right.
Yeah, I mean-
restoring habitat, it's improving biodiversity. It's definitely something we ought to study more, but you know, the landowners are being sold this not just on, and most of them aren't interested in the money, believe it or not. They're interested in biodiversity, habitat, better ecosystem processes, a healthier forest. And we can give them that with a little bit of thinning.
Cool. I mean, I guess if I was a landowner, I'd be like, okay, where's, let's see the data.
Yeah, and we provided lots of good information down on it. We've had issues of the Woodlander dedicated to explaining this, and they all got copies of it.
Well,
I mean, yeah, I mean, it seems like you got some more work to do, I guess, if to try and get people on board.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
at least we're doing something.
it seems like there is lots more to be done, and Sean has certainly scratched the surface here and sort of sees maybe what can be done in the future. So thank you for stimulating this conversation and debate. I think that's enough time for Sean to be fielding questions. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Sean.